Yeah. Looks like you guys enjoy me being a history teacher. And because I like to please, I'm gonna do it again. In the last episode of this series, I looked into the history of one of the most recognizable racing brands out there, Team Associated. But now, it's time to look at one of their main rivals, Losi, now known as Team Losi Racing. Team Losi Racing, or TLR, is one of the most popular racing brands in the US, and as a result, it's not too difficult to find them running around most, if not all, local tracks in the US to some capacity. They've all become a mainstay in the world of RC racing, and the RC world in general. Before we begin, however, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Be sure to comment which topic you'd like me to cover next. We've got a decent amount to cover, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. Before there was Team Losi, there was Veriflex. Veriflex was a skateboarding company started by Gil Losi Sr., his brother, and nephew. Gil Jr. and his brother enjoyed skateboarding and took part in a lot of events in the late 70s. That's when one day, an RC track opened up next to the skate park near Veriflex's headquarters. Losi Sr. bought some kits home, and Losi Jr. decided to build them and race them at this track. Now, even though Losi Jr. enjoyed skateboarding, he didn't much care for the culture at the time. After his last competition he competed in, the guys he was with reportedly trashed a local Denny's. After this, he decided to get away from skateboarding and dedicate his time to RC racing, eventually becoming a driver for Associated. Yes, that Associated. Losi Sr. built an RC track next to the skate park they owned, and began racing there as well. Not long after that, however, the city shut them down due to a few legal reasons like lack of permit and lack of insurance. After this little misstep, they decided to buy a place called the Ranch Pit Stop, and it was sketchy as fuck. What I mean by this is that one of the partners tried to rip them off, and the other warned them that if they bought the place, they would probably be killed. Initially, they were a mail order business but once Losi Sr. took over, it would evolve into an importer and distributor business. They imported and sold kits from Yokomo, Kyosho, and another company I can't name for fear of retribution from the almighty YouTube bots. Anyway, in the early 80s, Losi started making pinion and spur gears, along with some hop-up parts for Tamiya, Yokomo, and Associated cars. While Losi Sr. was handling the business sides of things, Losi Jr. was out racing and designing for Associated, specifically the RC12L electric pan car, the L standing for Losi. After this, they once again asked for help in designing another car I talked about before, the RC10 two-wheel drive buggy. Losi gave them a deal. He would help them under two conditions. The Losis would get 10% off on all cars coming from Associated, and they wanted 3,000 of them. The founder and owner of Associated, Roger Curtis, agreed. At one point or another, they realized they weren't getting the kits they asked for, and decided to invite Gene Hussing and Roger Curtis to lunch to see what was going on. According to Gene and Roger, other distributors were getting upset that they weren't getting the kits they needed, and said it wasn't fair to those distributors that only focus on the ranch and their bottom line. In short, the previous agreement wasn't going to be honored anymore. And at this point that Losi Sr. basically said, screw it, I'm going to design and build my own buggy. He stopped selling hop-up parts for the RC10, mostly because the supplier didn't want to make the parts anymore, and got to work. I don't know if you know this, but designing and building a brand new buggy costs money. Money that Losi didn't really have at the time. Even though the Ranch Pit Stop was making a decent enough profit, it wasn't enough to pay for a new design. As a result of this, they decided to take out a loan on their house, along with a few other non-mentioned methods to fund the project. Initially, all the designs were hand-drawn and hand-dremeled. No computer was used in the making of the initial JRX2. Money wasn't the only issue, however. There was also the issue of finding a machine shop that would actually work with them. Prior to RC, like I mentioned in my previous video about Associated, slot cars were all the rage, and routinely worked with machine shops to build parts. When the slot car industry crashed, that left a lot of shops with unpaid bills and bouncing checks. Machine shops around the country were hesitant to jump into another thing they weren't sure was going to last the long term. Eventually, they got a two-man machine shop team to work with them, with Losi Jr. joining it to make it three. Despite all of this, the money problems did not end there. You see, Gil Losi Sr. wanted to release replacement parts alongside the kits, but didn't have the money to do so. So he got into contact with Vice President of Hobbyco at the time, Alan Green. Gil offered Hobbyco the first 1,000 JRX2s, so long as they were paid for up front. The next day, a check showed up on Gil's desk for $137,000. You can do the math on how much each kit cost them. The JRX2 itself became a huge success, selling out in a very short time frame. The JRX2's main competitor, of course, was the RC10, however it was very different in its design. Chief among them was the graphite chassis and the 5-link rear suspension. This helped the buggy soak up the bumps on the early foam dirt tracks of yesteryear. However, as tracks got smoother, they ended up releasing a Pro conversion kit that came with a longer chassis and a traditional H-arm rear suspension. Even though the JRX2 never cracked a podium spot at IFMAR, it was still a successful buggy that kept going for a little while. They also ended up using it for the basis of their stadium truck called the JRX-T, after seeing third-party companies selling their own conversion kits. After the JRX2 was semi-retired, a few new buggies from Losi would come onto the scene. The first one of note came out in 1990, and it was called the Junior 2. It was meant to be a budget version of the JRX Pro with a traditional H-arm suspension. As a budget car, it had plastic molded chassis and plastic molded shock towers to cut on cost, along with bushings instead of bearings. After that, the JRX Pro SE was released not long after that in 1990. It also employed Losi's first use of a slipper clutch, along with the Junior 2's molded chassis. Later on, in 1993, the Losi XX came out. The XX was more or less a revised Junior 2 with a different front end and a revised transmission, along with all the other upgrades you'd expect from a premium kit. It's also important to note that the XX's transmission was the first from Losi to be designed on a PC, which for the 90s was kind of a big deal. It's also important to note that the team versions of these cars were a lot lighter than their market counterparts. They were built into CNC machines to more accurately trim weight, along with the hydrodrive being ground down to save more weight, whatever a hydrodrive is. Later on, in 1996, they came out with a revised version called the CR. Along with it came a revised rear suspension setup and modified A-arms that allow you to run sway bars. And that leads me to 1997, with the IFMAR 10-scale Worlds being held where else but the literal home of Losi in Pomona, California. You see, little spoiler, in the last video I claimed that Team Associated had won the 1997 IFMAR 10-scale Worlds, but this was not the case. You see, prior to the actual IFMAR Worlds, there was a short warm-up race that took place at the venue and everybody showed up. Team Associated pretty much crushed it, placing 9 out of 10 drivers in the top 10. Now, according to a few people at Losi, they had some big brain plays coming up. Early on in the day, the entire Losi team had a secret meeting comparing notes, and from the looks of it, they had a car and driver, Brian Kinwald at the time, who were able to return laps half a second faster and do it much easier. The decision was made to not show their hand during the warm-up race. What made the story a bit funnier at the time, at the expense of AE, was that Team Associated had already started making ads about how they were cleaning house at the Worlds, with 9 out of 10 drivers at the top being AE. During the main event, however, Brian Quinwald would go on to bring home Losi's first ever IFMAR 10-scale win. To celebrate this achievement, Losi released the XX CR Kinwald Edition. It was basically a CR with blue anodized hardware and a few other small things like dish wheels. In 1999, just before the turn of the millennium, they released the XX. The XX was a completely new design, and to the untrained eye, it may look a little bit similar to how the B4 two-wheel drive buggy from AE came out. You can make of that what you will. Anyway, that year with XX, Brian Kinwald won the Roar Nationals rather easily with the new buggy. However, he was unable to pull off a win during the IFMAR Worlds, placing 3rd overall. Another little curiosity about the XX was the dirt spec version. This was supposed to be similar to the old Junior 2, made as an entry-level buggy coming with bushings instead of bearings and all that. You might have noticed, however, that the tires that the car came with were, blue. Apparently, this was to try and start a new spec tire class, but it didn't really take off. And apparently they smelled awful in the heat. Anyway, the XX would go on to win Losi another IFMAR title in 2002. However, after that, it seems like Losi really struggled to win in the two-wheel drive situation. Even though at a national and local level, they seemed to be doing just fine. Later on, they would go on to release the XX CR in 2007, but in 2011, they would release the buggy I mentioned in the AE history video, the 22 two-wheel drive buggy. Like I mentioned in that video, the buggy was extremely good. It was an extremely well put together with high quality parts, along with the capability to run a mid-motor setup with an aluminum pan chassis. Yes, I am aware that there were other conversion kits to allow you to run a mid-motor setup all the way back to the RC10, but none of them came from the factory directly with that ability. Regardless of whether or not the mid-motor setup was popular at your local track, it was still a stepping stone for the mid-motor configurations we see today, all the way up to the modern-day 22 5.0 Elite kit. Now, to look at the history of the four-wheel drive buggy from Losi, we need to go back a few decades, to 1985 specifically, with the RPS Yokomo Dogfighter. It was designed by Gil Losi Jr. in the olden days of RC racing, where he took it to win the first IFMAR 10-scale World Championship for four-wheel drive buggy, something that will become a running theme soon enough. Fast forward a few years to 1997, and we have the XX four-wheel drive buggy. Initially, Gil Losi Jr. wanted to outsource the design of the car to another engineer. However, said engineer couldn't really get it to work correctly and basically threw in the towel. After this, Losi Jr. went through the car to fix as many problems as he could, leading him to develop a hatred of the car itself. Not just because the car was a pain to design, but also to race competitively. Not because it was slow, it was a missile, but because it was painfully brittle. It was more or less a touring car on stilts. Granted, this was the case for a lot of earlier four-wheel drive buggies for the most part, but it was especially the case for the XX4. With that being said, it was still successful enough to warrant a new special edition in 1999 after Jukka Stenari took the dub at IFMAR World Championship in Finland in 1999 in the four-wheel drive class. As a result, they released a World Edition the same year, and it came with a few different parts like a low center of gravity chassis and a lower motor mount, all things that made the car very good to drive, and a tad bit more durable. In 2002, a brand new buggy was released to coincide with the XX two-wheel drive buggy. Of course, this buggy would be called the XX4. However, the car would have to be delayed as the belts they were using couldn't handle the coming wave of more powerful off-road motors, specifically brushless motors. The design of the car was based off a single belt design of the XXS touring car. As a result, it was pretty adept at the growing in popularity smooth track surfaces, but struggled on the bumpier stuff. Once again, the XX4 would be on track to win the four-wheel drive IFMAR title with Jukka at the wheel. However, the biggest weakness of the XX4 revealed itself when the chassis cracked in half, forcing Jukka to finish the program with his old XX4. He still won, but it still hurt to see the prototype car not be able to finish the race. This kind of set the tone for a lot of things related to four-wheel drive world in Losi, and going back to the XX4 original design, as we are now going to skip forward to 2013. The 22-4 was essentially supposed to be a XX4 with a much more efficient drivetrain, and it absolutely was. It saw a lot of success at the national level, and thanks to the driving at Dakota Fend, a decent amount of success depending on your perspective at the international level, when the car debuted in the 2013 IFMAR Worlds and placed 8th. Not too bad, but not the success they were looking for. In fact, Losi wouldn't crack 8th place until 2019 at the Huddy Arena, placing 2nd in the four-wheel drive buggy class, again thanks to Dakota Fend. Regardless of their planned placings at high-level races, Team Losi Racing remains to be one of the most popular RC racing brands in the US, even though they can't really escape from a decent bit of controversy thanks to their parent company. And for that, we once again have to go back a few years. After a while of running the company, Gil Losi Sr. began to get tired and wanted to go back to his passion of hot rodding. As a result, he decided to sell his company to Horizon Hobby in 2001. This is also the point in time in which a decent chunk of the manufacturing process of RC cars began to shift towards China. Because of this, and because of Horizon Hobby's propensity to buy anything that moves, people began to resent Horizon Hobby and Losi itself by proxy. This wasn't really the biggest issue, however, for racing fans. After all, Team Associated cars are also manufactured in China, so what's the big deal here? Well, at the end of the day, Horizon Hobby is a business. And as a business, their main goal is to make more money. And these days in the RC world, to make more money, you need to get into the bashing market. And because of this, Horizon Hobby tried to move Losi into being the premier bashing brand for Horizon's family. If you're paying attention, there wasn't really much to say about Losi's racing programs in terms of wins or production of new cars between 2003 and 2011, and that wasn't just because of the slump in RC at the time. That's because a lot of Losi's focus at the time was geared towards bashers. This really rubbed Gil Losi Jr. the wrong way, and as a result, he left to join Team Kyosho where he felt more welcome. It was only until the 22 two-wheel drive buggy was released when Horizon basically said, alright, we need a racing brand, and split the part of Losi off to create what we now know as Team Losi Racing. Much later on, because of this new focus on racing, Gil Losi Jr. would come back to work for the team. Overall, the story of Losi continues to be an interesting one. It's filled with drama, triumph, loss, espionage, and casual death threats. Regardless of that, Team Losi Racing continues to be a mainstay on local tracks all the way up to the big boy events like IFMAR and Roar. Love them or hate them, I think they're here to stay. And that's all for now. If you liked the video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more. Also, I'd like to apologize for taking so long to make this video. With midterms and family events taking up most of my time, it was hard to be able to sit down and actually make and edit this video. If you want to support me another way, there's my Patreon, where I post updates on what's going on with ideas and channel as a whole. Speaking of which, I'd like to thank my patrons Michael Williams, Lucas Tarka, RC World Discord server, Casey Nix, Ben Reeves, Dave Armstrong, Juliet Lovelace, Ryan Lamb, Joe Jenkins, and of course, Merson Wad. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.